Because of Hungary's conflict with the EU and blocking Ukraine's steps, the European Union, EU, officially started negotiations to allow Ukraine to join, but could not pass a €50 billion aid package because of Hungary's negative vote. Prime Minister Hungarian General Viktor Orbán is said to have walked out of the meeting room with an abstention vote when the EU launched the historic step of negotiating membership for Ukraine. The event that took place during the summit meeting of EU leaders in Brussels, Belgium, on December 14 and 15 reflects the deep conflict between Hungary and the EU. But why is it that while the EU top brass cheers Ukraine on, a member of this bloc like Hungary constantly gets in the way? As an EU member, the relationship between Hungary and the EU has weakened over the past 10 years. Most believe that this relationship has worsened since Prime Minister Orbán took power in 2010. In the media, Mr. Orbán is often described with words such as populist, far-right, or authoritarian, which are not widely supported in mainstream politics in Europe. The Hungarian leader has also fought many times with countries in the bloc because of differences in approach to many issues. Not long after Mr. Orbán was re-elected with an overwhelming majority in 2022, the EU opened an investigation into the country's election. This is the milestone that led to procedures to strip funding for Hungary with concerns about democratic standards. A few months before that election, Hungary introduced a controversial law prohibiting promoting homosexuality or transgenderism to minors. The law has angered activists, and European politicians see it as an attack on the recognition and rights of the LGBTQ+ community. LGBTQ+ represents a wide range of issues that describe the differences between Hungary and the rest of Europe around human rights and the rule of law. From the media to scientific articles, Hungary is called a zombie democracy, meaning that democracy only exists in a formal way. In September 2022, the European Parliament declared that Hungary was no longer a full democracy, and that the EU needed to take action. In April 2023, 15 out of 27 EU members took legal action against Hungary over concerns around laws they considered anti-LGBTQ+. Reasons for Hungary's opposition to Ukraine: tensions over human rights and the rule of law led to the EU's decision to freeze more than €30 billion in cohesion and recovery rules that would be sent to Hungary. The EU side requires Hungary to meet standards and implement reforms to restore access to this money. With Hungary having long publicly opposed aid to Ukraine as well as Ukraine's admission to the EU, many opinions believe that the EU will have to pay attention to the issue of disbursement of the above amount of money as a card to convince Budapest. To put it in a negative way, before the EU summit meeting in Brussels, Belgium, this week, Hungary used Ukraine as a hostage so that the EU had to release the frozen €30 billion. On December 13, the EU made a move that was seen as a final concession effort before the meeting, when the European Commission allowed Hungary access to €10 billion. However, in a speech on the same day, Hungarian Prime Minister Orbán affirmed that his country still opposes starting membership negotiations for Ukraine, and does not even want to include this issue in the discussion. According to Mr. Orbán, EU countries should use their own money to aid Ukraine, instead of using the EU's common fund. Like Hungary, Ukraine is required by the EU to implement reforms to join this bloc. In a long-standing argument, Hungary has emphasized that Ukraine has not performed well in reform, so this is the reason why Budapest opposes starting negotiations for Ukraine to join. In other words, from Hungary's perspective, the EU is practicing double standards. On the one hand, the EU cut off funds to Hungary because of reform issues. On the one hand, Brussels wants to use the common fund to aid Ukraine, and start negotiations for Ukraine to join despite still debating the extent of Kiev's reforms. Germany's blank ballot and strange moves. The EU conceded €10 billion, Hungary also more or less restrained. Hungary blocked the aid package for Ukraine, but did not vote against starting negotiations on Ukraine's EU accession status. However, the details of Hungary's abstention say more about the EU's problem. According to a report by Politico newspaper, German Prime Minister Olaf Scholz suggested that if Hungarian Prime Minister Orbán did not want Ukraine to join the EU, then Mr. Orbán could consider leaving the meeting room. According to Mr. Scholz, This will help the remaining 26 EU member states approve Ukraine to start negotiations. In fact, EU regulations do not require complete unanimity. This means that even if a member country leader like Mr. Orban is absent, consensus is still guaranteed. The European press seemed optimistic about this development, describing Mr. Orban's departure and abstention as a move to help Ukraine's path into the EU go smoothly. But looking at the big picture, the principle of consensus is what Hungary and Poland are both concerned about when talking about the EU wanting to change its regulations. In the treaty, if the EU abandons the principle of consensus in favor of decision-making based on majority votes, this will mean some countries are left behind, especially incomplete democracies as they are. Call Hungary. After Britain left the EU in the event known as Brexit, the EU spent many years struggling with survival. Whether this comes from the widespread wave of populist and far-right politics in Europe or from the EU itself, it is still a big concern that needs to be resolved, instead of just the Hungary-Ukraine story.